all of you all joining us virtually today. My name again is Malycki Mañon-Sosa. I am the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Director here at the Iowa State Bar Association. This is a part of an ongoing DEI educational series put on by the Iowa State Bar Association. Today's session is DEI in solo and small firms. So before we get started today, I have a couple of agreements or kind of standards that I have with every presentation that I give as the DEI director here at the Iowa State Bar Association, especially understanding that our association represents such a diverse array of individuals, specifically around perspectives as well. I think it's always important to start with these. So I always ask folks, if I ask you what happens in Vegas, I hope none of you are answering that question unless some of you are working remote in from Vegas today. But another way that I like to rephrase this is lessons leave, but stories stay. I invite you to have conversation and dialogue. I know that there's a Q&A function in today's webinar, so please feel free to drop any questions or comments or conversational pieces in there today regarding today's session. But then more conversation, less confrontation. That's really where that stems from, is have conversations today or used information that you get throughout these DEI series that ISBA has put on over the last couple of months here to have conversations with individuals or even yourself amongst yourselves when you are maybe confronted with something that doesn't align with your values or maybe doesn't make sense. Because when we are comfortable with being uncomfortable, as we transition to the next bullet point there, we can grow, right? For us as humans, that's where the most amount of growth happens, is when we expand our comfort zone, expand our range of knowledge. And so with that, then you should always ask, and I hope that I will be able to answer any questions you have today regarding DEI, not only in regards to today's session, but overall regarding DEI at ISBA and our legal profession, and throughout the other sessions that are held regarding our DEI educational series. Finally then, the last two bullets, good intentions do not always equal positive impacts. This is really important for us to understand as we are kind of navigating this space. We always can lean in to DEI or learning about others with the best of intentions, but sometimes, right, the best of intentions do not always have the best impacts. And so with that said, we can understand that maybe when we are navigating spaces with those intentions, we can negatively impact others. So it's always important to remember that final bullet point, RESPECT. I hope you know what it means for yourselves, because I know what it means for me. And so if we can treat others with just human dignity and respect, the world would be a lot better place. And understanding, especially in today's profession and today's climate, I think we all could use a little bit more of that. So as we kind of get into the thick of the information here regarding DEI and things like that, initiatives, excuse me, DEI initiatives, it's important to understand what DEI is. For us at ISBA, we have defined DEI pretty clearly, but I'm going to kind of, for lack of better term, simplify it for us today. So diversity, right? Diversity is talking about the mix of different identities and their representation within a specific or general group. And this is really important to note that it's the mix of different and it's a mix of all. So again, it's not select identities. It's not just a lot of times people think when we talk about diversity, we're only talking about those who maybe are of a specific sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, national origin, etc. But it's really important to note when we talk about diversity, if we're only talking about one specific characteristic, that in and of itself is not very diverse, right? And so when we talk about diversity, we'll kind of talk about the different ways that we can talk about diversity and the characteristics and identities of folks in specific and general groups. Then equity is evaluating practices, policies, or rules, and then making sure, right, that we can adjust them to create an environment of opportunity for all within that mix. And it's really important to note that it's an environment of opportunity. We want to make sure that everyone has the same access to be successful and to obtain opportunities. But right, we also know that we're humans, and sometimes, right, we don't always capitalize on those opportunities. But the difference there, right, equity seeks to address oftentimes seeks to address historical or systemic barriers. We'll talk a little bit in the next couple of slides what those things are. So don't get too hung up on what historical or systemic barriers are just yet. And then finally, inclusion is how policies and practices and those rules bring those who maybe aren't a part of a majority group into the mix, or maybe the group that's not in power, if you will, into the mix, and allows them to show up authentically without fear, have a seat at the table, be heard, and have them participating and belonging within that group. So for example, again, I'll go through some more detail here in the coming slides, but it's truly about how we as a group, right, set up rules or standards, and how those standards impact everyone of different identities, and how maybe some people don't feel comfortable sharing or maybe speaking up in certain settings because of those rules and policies, right, which then goes back into equity. So with that, I think it's really important to start by giving you all this really good kind of comprehensive list that diversity is more than just race or gender. So often we do talk about race or gender when we're talking about diversity, but I always think it's good to share this slide. This is shared in a lot of my presentations to make sure that we understand that diversity makes up a lot of things, right? And so I know that you all could read and see this as well, so I'll let you kind of go through this list with me. But one of the major ones, or some of the couples that I get a few questions about, are cognitive style. That's the way that our brains process information. We all have various neural pathways in our brain, and as I'm speaking to you all now, we're all processing information differently. And it's really important to note that cognitive style can relate a lot of times to like neurodivergency. I know that's a big word, and it's really important to note that it relates to mental health, well-being, disability, and ability status, but also talks about then those impacts that impact our brain and how we develop or process information. Then I also get questions about organizational function. It's really important to note, right, that again, diversity can go beyond just our basic identities that we hold as a person. It can also play a role in maybe what roles we're taking on in a specific group. So for example, an organizational function here at ISBA, I am our DEI director, right? And so most often in my role, I get to speak up and speak out around DEI initiatives and access and things of that nature. However, right, if we have, for example, an hourly employee who only works a couple days, maybe they feel like they can't often be heard because they're not maybe in specific meetings, they maybe don't have a specific title, right? And so that's really important, especially when we're talking about firms, maybe smaller firms, but also then it's also important to talk when we're talking about solo practitioners, the way that you work in your firm. And we'll talk about some of these things as we move along. But again, military status and types of service, so our veterans, things of that nature, it's important to note that those are all characteristics that are characterized under diversity. So then equity, right? I really want us to give us a full understanding of equity. A lot of times we talk about equity and maybe some confusion around it. A lot of times people also have problems with that word because they think equity does not mean equality. And I would tell people that they are correct. It does not mean equity does not equal equality, and there is a distinct difference. So equality versus equity, right? Equality is everyone gets the same treatment, benefits, etc., regardless of their identity, status, ability, etc. And so for some of us, right, or for the very basic understanding, we think that we all want to be treated equally, right? That makes sense. While equity takes in, everyone gets what they need to achieve their full potential without posing limits to others. So a lot of times that's a key piece for equity when we're defining it. A lot of times people think that equity versus equality, equity is giving folks more a piece of a pie. It's really important to note that our resources are not pie. There's enough to go around, and some of us, right, maybe have more than others. And so we want to make sure that we can all achieve success regardless. And so when I always give the example, I know there's this graphic on the slide here with this fence that's the most standard kind of example of equality versus equity. But I always like to use the example of shoes. So for example, today, let's say you signed up to participate in today's CLE, and ISBA is going to send you all a box of shoes. And luckily for you all, I'm the presenter, so I'm choosing your shoes today. I like to think that I have a pretty good taste in shoes. And so you're all going to get the exact same shoes that I'm wearing today. They are 10.5 Cole Haan dress shoes. Maybe some of you are thinking, ew, disgusting. Maybe some of you are thinking, I can't fit into a 10.5. Maybe my feet are too small, too big, too wide, whatever it might be. But with that in mind, right, equality means that you're all going to get that same shoe. You're all going to get that 10.5 Cole Haan shoe from Malycki. While equity takes into consideration, right, your shoe size, maybe what feels best for your shoe or your foot. Maybe you want something that looks a little bit more stylish. Maybe you're working in a professional setting, or maybe you want something that's more athleisure wear, right? Like a training tennis shoe. But then, right, that's kind of the difference there, right? Some of us sometimes again will think that equality, right? Why does someone with a size 13 get more fabric for their shoe than I do, right? But at the end of the day, right, we're both achieving success because we get to put the shoe on. And I'll also give the example. I think this is really important. The example that I just gave also is not entirely equitable. Why? Because it's assuming that we all have feet to put the shoe on in the first place, right? And so that's the important distinction that we have to continuously make between equality and equity, is that equity, right, really takes into consideration what each individual needs to be successful, and especially when we're talking in our firms and things of that nature. And right, I think it's also important right now, I'm just talking about those of us who maybe are lucky enough to work in a small firm where there's a small group of us, but it's also important to note that if you're a solo practitioner, right, these things also can imply to your clients. And we'll talk how this can impact your client base as well in a few moments. But again, so I made that comment about why should some people get more fabric for their shoes in the first place, right? Because again, it's not a pie. It's important to note that there are systemic barriers, and these were inequities or setbacks that were created intentionally or unintentionally. It's really important to note that piece by systems created to serve a majority population. And so I always like to use the example of that fence. We go back to this fence example now, right? If we took the average height of every human in our country and we made a fence, we made every fence that size, and we're not doing chain link fence, we're not doing maybe even the shutter fence where you can maybe see through the crack, we're just putting up a wall, right? And so some of us are lucky enough to maybe be that average height and maybe stand on our tippy toes and see what's over that wall there, and some of us are even lucky to maybe be taller than the average individual. But then that leaves into account, right, there are individuals who would never get to see over that wall. And so that's a systemic barrier, right? That barrier was created maybe to serve us or protect us. But then, right, as society changes, as we progress, or as we learn more about others, we can start to see or understand oh, maybe some people can't see over that wall, or maybe that wall is even imposing limits to others. Maybe on the other side of that wall is a great resource for a specific group of individuals, right? And so that's just a really kind of coherent or collective way of thinking about equity versus equality there, and why we use equity over equality. And then inclusion, right? Inclusion is pretty straightforward. It's the act of creating a sense of authentic participation and belonging within a group. And so it's really important to note that the benefits of being included, right? If I feel included in my workplace, or feel included in the process, my legal processes, even if I'm talking as a client, right? I can feel committed to shared goals. Maybe I'm willing to share more information with you as my attorney on how you can help me. Dedication to include others as well, right? If you've done a great job including or serving a specific group of clients, maybe they'll go back to their own communities and share just how great of a law firm or lawyer you are. Unique perspectives and ways of thinking. This is also important, specifically when we're talking about maybe a smaller firm, because the more diverse and unique perspectives we have, the more innovation that we can achieve. It also creates positive relationships and cultures, again, with and internally and externally within firms or practices. Improved communication and understanding. When I feel included, I'm more likely to speak up, speak out, explain myself to you, right? And being understood is really important, especially when we're talking about serving our clients, right? We don't want to have miscommunication between our clients, have our clients feel frustrated maybe with how we communicated or understood them. And so that inclusion piece is essential. And then, right, just overall, pretty straightforward that being included makes individuals feel valued, respected, and supported. So overall, I just kind of want to give you an overcapsulation of DEI as a theory or a practice. Diversity, equity, inclusion do work together to achieve successful teams, programs, services, client bases, and again, that list just keeps growing and going on. But it's also important to note that you can have one without the other. I talk about this often. So it's possible to have a diverse group of individuals, but not everyone feeling included. Maybe a diverse group of individuals and not everyone being treated equitably. So for example, I oftentimes use maybe in a smaller firm, you have, and we'll talk about HR and those departments in smaller firms or even in solo practice as well. But it's important to note, right, maybe some benefits don't benefit everyone in your workplace. A lot of times people think of maternal leave versus paternal leave, right? Ensuring that any parent can take leave whenever they have a child, things of that nature. But then it's also important to note that DEI then and now is continuously changing. DEI was a concept. If you had the privilege to tune into Henry Hamilton's DEI Then, Now, and Forever CLE presentation, it really talked about the history of the United States and civil rights and law that's rooted in DEI work and how it's evolved throughout the course of time. Especially understanding though right now that DEI is a hot button issue, we can expect DEI to change, and it will continue to change throughout the history of time. I promise you that, but DEI is not going anywhere as of right now. And it's important to note that DEI isn't equal. And that kind of pushes you to, I want to kind of push you to my photo there of that playbook, if you will. DEI, while it is ever changing, also looks different for every firm, business, and organization, depending on a lot of factors. And we'll talk about those factors as well. But obviously, I hear this often, right? What major firms maybe are doing here in Des Moines look a lot different in terms of DEI, especially, or just in general, when you compare them to maybe a solo practitioner in rural Iowa, right? And so it's really important to note that DEI is a playbook and it can help us in a lot of various ways, right? But sometimes, right, we're all on different pages, and some factors, some of us have access to maybe more funds, etc. If we're maybe at a smaller firm than maybe someone practicing solo practice. But it's also important to note that DEI overall right, is really important. I hope even just in these first couple of slides, you've seen the value, because oftentimes this is seen as less important work. Again, it's important to note that here in Iowa, you're only required 1 hour of either diversity or wellness. And I think that that's important to note, right, that wellness and diversity, those two things are seen as less important in the fact that they're able to be interchanged, right? But I think wellness goes hand in hand with a lot of things that happen in our legal profession, but I think so does DEI. So if you ever have the opportunity to maybe pick up an extra hour here or there of wellness or diversity credits, I'm a strong advocate of that, because sometimes people just think that they don't have time to educate themselves on these things that are very important for the work that we do in our profession. Then I also want to talk slightly about DEI progression and what it looks like, especially when we're talking about different levels of firms. If you're a solo firm, maybe out in rural Iowa versus a small firm here in Des Moines, it's important to note that it's a process, right? DEI is not just like, again, that cookie cutter. It is a progress that we all go through. And so DEI always starts with exposure to people who maybe are different cultures, different, again, diversity traits. I gave you that long list. Then we can start to develop awareness of specific different identities. Then we can start to understand those identities, become competent in understanding and like maybe even communicating or serving a specific demographic or diversity characteristic. And then we can start to engage them when we're confident. A lot of times, right, and again, it's important to note that this is cyclical. You can go back and forth, you can learn and unlearn. It's a very, it's not a very linear progress. That's why the arrows keep pushing forward. But then I also want to just give a brief kind of shout out to the place that I get to work, the Iowa State Bar Association, and our commitment to diversity, which we made in 2023, the year that I was hired. I've included our diversity statement. It's also available on our webpage. We also issued a reaffirmation of our diversity statement earlier this year in light of all of the anti-DEI work that was being done in our society. So with that, then I think it's important to start talking about why you should start caring about this, especially as solo or small firm practitioners. So first and foremost, the benefits of DEI, diverse teams are statistically proven to work better. And again, you might be thinking, maybe I'm a solo practitioner. Hold on for me just a second. But it's statistically proven that more diverse groups recall logic, make more ethical decisions or better ethical decisions. They increase innovation and collaboration, and they outperform companies or firms with less diverse teams. Then diverse teams also stick around. More diverse teams report a higher morale, retention, brand loyalty, and engagement. That means, right, especially if maybe you're a small firm and you're tired of maybe trying to continuously pay out to hire and grow your network, it's important to note that if you hire diverse folks who maybe have different characteristics than you or maybe other attorneys in your small firm, you get the privilege then of having a higher rate of retention. But then also diverse teams also increase reputation. Again, it's important to note that it's considered more attractable, can improve attractiveness both internally and externally if you're looking to hire or pick up clients, right? I always use the example of, again, my name is Malycki, Mañon-Sosa. I have a Latin last name. And when I first started at ISBA, I did start to receive some calls to my direct line from Spanish speakers, right? Because they saw that my last name was Spanish. So they maybe made an assumption, but also were hopeful, right, that someone could help them or speak to them in their native language. And that's just an example, right, of the benefit of diversity and also an example of how it can grow your client base, right? So we'll talk about accessibility of language and ability and things of that nature as we move on. But also DEI by the numbers. It's important to note that nearly 80% of US workers reported in a survey done by Pew report, Pew Research, that they consider DEI when job searching. Again, it didn't share if that was like a negative or positive connotation, but 80% of us are looking at DEI. And again, that's up for us to determine if that's a good or a bad thing. But it's also important to note that nearly 75% of Gen Z and millennials in the workforce would leave their job if they don't believe DEI is a priority of leadership and management. Then following COVID-19 or the pandemic, 9 out of 10 workers after the pandemic now believe that it is that ethical and transparent leadership, flexible work environments, and work at home policies and inclusive efforts are non-negotiable. So again, especially if we're a small firm, maybe looking to start to recruit, or maybe we're a solo practitioner and we want to start building out a succession plan for maybe when we're preparing to retire. It's important to note that that next generation and this next generation of workers are looking for things related to DEI. And then nearly 80% of US workers express feeling continuous workplace stress. This is inclusive of you all on this as well. And then 60% reported that stress having a negative impact on their lives outside of their work environment. So again, it's then important to note that another 60% reported that they felt that their stress was manageable due to the support of their colleagues. And again, you might be thinking as a solo practitioner, what does that mean for me? You can still rely on your colleagues in the legal profession. You can engage with ISBA because you can develop that network of support. And we'll talk again, especially for solo practitioners, on how to build that network out. But it's also important to note that there are opportunities for us to do DEI wrong. I've seen it done often wrong. First, performative DEI, especially in light of everything happening right now. In today's society, we've been seeing more and more performative DEI efforts, or discovering that some organizations were simply performative in relation to DEI. And so performative DEI is also sometimes called virtue signaling, excuse me, I can't talk today. And this occurs when an organization or business or a firm displays its awareness or takes a specific stance on an issue to demonstrate goodwill or to stay relevant, while often lacking a strategic plan, intentional actions, or even having an impact at all. So we are now in June, so I use the example of Pride Month. There is a thing in DEI called rainbow washing. And rainbow washing is when we hit June, all of a sudden we see all these rainbows and logos, and in our maybe shops, we see all kinds of Pride memorabilia or apparel. I use the example of Target there. Every June, Target has a huge Pride display, and then sometimes it just vanishes, right? It's hard to find after Pride. And that's an example of performative DEI, right? Intentional DEI means, right, you would maybe have that Pride stuff out all year long. And then we also saw, I know that it was in the headlines, I think a couple years ago, regarding Bud Light and their rainbow cans, and then it went away, right? And so again, it's really important to note that when we make or take actions outwardly to express our support of things or DEI in general, that we do so strategically. Then also it's important to note that there are some individuals, especially who work in the DEI profession, that will say that it's okay, or that we should be setting quotas or standards and perform unethical hiring practices. And this is where we get into trouble with DEI. This is where DEI gets a bad rap. And it comes from those practices there, right? Hopefully we all understand that it's illegal to set quotas and to hire based on immutable characteristics or protected classes. And so, right, I know it's important to talk about the Iowa Attorney General issuing a warning in 2023 that anyone who partook in DEI practices was at risk of being sued. I promise you, if you're partaking in DEI practices ethically and in the correct way, you will not be sued. In fact, hopefully you'll see the opposite. You'll see money coming in rather than going out, but it is possible, right? And it is important to note that there are organizations and individuals who work in the DEI field or even HR field related to DEI that are doing these things, or telling firms or individuals that they can do these things. And again, that just kind of fuels that attack on DEI. Then also it's important to note that there's a lot of experts without any true expertise. A lot of times, right, maybe we'll bring individuals in who maybe hold a specific characteristic to talk about said characteristic. And while experience gives us a lot of knowledge to maybe who we are and how we experience things, it does not mean, right, we're an expert in said field, right? Just because maybe I'm an individual with a Latin last name does not mean I'm an expert on law, Latin individuals, right? And so that's really important to note that we need to be looking at individuals who maybe are coming in doing CLEs for us to make sure that they have the expertise or the experience in education and understand the ethical ways of implementing DEI initiatives. It's also important to note that a lot of times, especially maybe I know that I've worked with some larger firms that sometimes vocalize that they feel like their leadership or their executive or their partners or whatever it might be aren't bought into DEI efforts. And right, that's really important to note that for DEI to work efficiently, an entire team has to be bought in. Maybe not 100% for everybody, and maybe some people, right, have the diverse perspective that DEI is wrong, but it's also important to note that if we're not having these conversations in the first place, right, we would never get there. So it's really important that we're all bought in some way, shape, or form, but then also the basics of bias, right? If we are unaware of just how biased every human is, we can fall into a lot of trouble. I oftentimes hear individuals, or I even talk about implicit bias, but a lot of times folks sometimes don't understand just how deep implicit bias is. Implicit bias is made up of a lot of different biases, such as affinity bias, which is the bias of seeing someone who has characteristics such as my own and liking them a little bit more than those who don't. But that's a natural function of our brain, and if we're unaware of that and we are not talking about it enough, we can really fall into some trouble there as well. And so when we're delivering DEI education, or you're learning or discovering DEI efforts or implementing them, first and foremost, always start with cross-cultural communication. That's going to help us communicate and navigate situations where maybe there's a difference in identity or perspective or religion, right? Or just diversity as a whole, any of those characteristics. And it's really important that we understand how to communicate cross-culturally. But then also understanding that any DEI education that you may run into outside of ISBA's DEI series, if they're making you feel like you should be ashamed or guilty or like they're dumping a problem on your lap, it's probably not a good DEI session for you. So again, a lot of times I think it's good to call out the identities that are oftentimes given that problem or made to feel guilty. And it's important to know, right, we as humans very rarely get to choose who we are or how we are born or what we look like or the identities that we hold. And so a lot of times I always share that if people are instantaneously talking about white, straight, cisgender, male, men, and Christians, while they all are identities, it's important to note that just because they're maybe of the majority, or maybe they're individuals who maybe have more power in society, if you will, in some regards, we can't be oftentimes dumping or shaming or making people feel guilty for who they are, because that creates the us versus them mentality and creates more division than good, right? DEI is all about building bridges, not setting them aflame. And so it's really important, right? At the core root of it, we're then asking people to care about you without knowing you versus nothing about us without us, right? And I think that last one is where we all should be aiming for, is nothing about us without us. How can we include individuals from different groups to be included in the work that we do? And then understand why we feel uncomfortable, address how to overcome and process it, and then give actionable steps. That's all good DEI. I hope that you get that from ISBA's DEI education series, as well as any DEI CLE that we put on our sponsor. But then the business case, right, for DEI, kind of getting into why you want to start thinking about this in the solo and small practice firm area. One, you're going to have better legal strategies if you have a diverse array of perspectives at your table. Understanding though, however, as a solo practitioner, maybe you're like, hey, it's only me and my firm. What do I do, right? It's really important to know that there's a great plethora of resources for our solo practitioners here at ISBA to engage with community and create a collaborative network with other small practice attorneys as well, or solo practitioners. So that way you can share your strategies, your ethics, your information regarding DEI and your practices. And so it's really important to note that you can engage with ISBA to create better legal strategies, even as a solo or small firm attorney. Then it's also important in attracting and retaining talent. Again, this is more for those who are looking to hire, but right then if we're even just solo practitioners, we can broaden our client base by doing this, right? I already kind of gave you one example of how DEI, or even just having diverse staff, maybe you have a diverse receptionist, maybe they're different than you or hold different identities than you in whatever way. I do use the term diverse, and I'm not just talking about race or gender, etc. I'm talking about that list I referenced earlier, but it can help you broaden your client base, right? Maybe, right, I bring in a receptionist who's part-time, who is a veteran, and they have a good connection with other veterans, and then all of a sudden, right, I can start serving more veterans in my area, whatever it might be. Then, right, improve client relationships. So again, if you're practicing DEI, maybe you are in rural Iowa as a solo practitioner. I know that this is a very real thing. And maybe you're in an area where there's a large number of migrant workers in our state. Iowa has a large population of migrant workers in our agricultural sector. And understanding, right, maybe you bring in some Spanish Spanish materials, or maybe you pay for your services or your website to be translated into Spanish for individuals, and that improves that client relationship there. It's also ethically imperative, right, especially for us as us in the legal profession, to understand that we have to serve our public, and if we are unaware of who or what makes up our public or our clients or our demographics of our clients, we can't serve them ethically or fully, right? To truly know somebody helps us serve them a lot better than if it's just someone walking off the street and we don't take the time to understand maybe where they're coming from or what started their problem in the first place, etc. It also helps create stronger reputations and branding. Again, word of mouth is huge for all humans. And so I talked about affinity bias for a bit. Affinity bias is, again, when we're drawn to individuals with similar traits as our own. And when you have a good relationship or a reputation with me, I'm more likely then to go to my group of individuals who maybe also hold my own identities in various ways and share how great of an attorney or firm you are. But let's talk specifically about the challenges, right? This is often where I get questions regarding solo and small practice firms and DEI efforts. Limited resources, right? These things take time, money, and personnel. And I understand, especially if we're in a solo firm, we don't all have the access to that, which also then feeds into time constraints as well. A lot of us are focused on getting those billable hours in, making our money, which is totally fine, or right, maybe our firm has that standard, and that's okay, but it's also important to note, right, that to use our time effectively or efficiently, right, we have to be aware, right, of our situation and our client, and that creates better communication, again, more innovation, right, and can help us serve our personnel or our clients. Then being unaware of unconscious bias. Oftentimes I've heard, and this kind of relates to my isolated environments bullet point, from individuals who maybe are in rural areas that, you know, I'm not working with a huge diverse array of individuals. And again, I always share that maybe it's because you're not marketing, or maybe it's because you're inaccessible. to other clients. And so that's really important to note that if we maybe have a bias that there's no diversity around us in any way, shape, or form, and everyone is just like us in our hometowns, I think we have a lot of work to do in terms of DEI. Then also understanding that a lot of you all probably lack a formal HR or DEI department. I'm happy to share that ISBA offers me as a resource to all of our members free of charge regarding any DEI work that you might be interested in. So please feel free to reach out at any time. You'll get my contact information here shortly. But then also understanding that the rural versus urban divide is very real in our state as we see the brain drain of attorneys in our state, specifically in our rural areas, right? It's important to note that those challenges are going to get harder and harder. And so we'll talk a little bit about how to overcome those differences there. But it's also really important to talk about diversity fatigue because I'm sure a lot of us are feeling it. I'm feeling it now more than ever. I know we're putting on a DEI series of education as well. So maybe some of you who have been in attendance for all of them, maybe you're feeling a little diversity fatigue. So stick with me here. But this is the act of individuals tiring from talking about DEI or diversity education, right? And this again happens to us as facilitators or professionals in the DEI sector, but also our audiences, even you all listening right now, right? Maybe even some of you have already tuned out. Maybe you have me ongoing in the background while you're checking some emails, and that's totally fine. But it's important to note that this occurs when we're seeing slow or no progress in terms of DEI initiatives. We're faced with challenging subjects. Maybe something conflicts with our values or the way that we perceive things, so we get a little defensive. We're met with animosity or hostility, right? Maybe we're shamed or guilted for who we are. Maybe we're not given any tangible efforts that we can make in our areas, or maybe there's no new information presented to us. And so that all can occur or create this environment of fatigue of, why are we talking about diversity? We're not getting anywhere. It doesn't align with my values, et cetera, right? And it's really important to note that this is a very real concept. So then how do we overcome all those challenges? How do we overcome the fatigue? And how do we have intentional, meaningful progress in relation to DEI initiatives? First and foremost, I always tell individuals, especially in our solo or small practice firms, that accessibility is where you need to focus. And so you might be thinking accessibility, what does that look like? For me, accessibility means making the services that we provide more accessible to the most amount of people possible. And so again, we can look at language, especially in our state, we have a language deficit. Oftentimes, again, when we get calls asking for attorneys, obviously we have no working attorneys for the public at ISBA. But, right, when I direct them to our, for example, our directory of members who are on our Find a Lawyer resource page, a lot of times, right, there's very few individuals that speak Spanish in our state when we have a large Spanish-speaking population. And it's also important to note that Spanish isn't even the only language that's being spoken. I know Bosnian, we have a large Bosnian population in our state as well. We have Marshallese Islanders, and so that list goes on. And so those are things that we can be looking at. There's a lot of online services that are offered that will translate your websites and make them more accessible to individuals. There's translation services where you can, especially now with AI, which maybe not is entirely correct, but it helps us get maybe halfway there, right? We can maybe translate some of our documents using AI if we're unable to afford translation services, but having those documents then also helps our clients to better understand our processes, our procedures, and what's happening for them if they are not just a primary English first speaker. Then also ability in terms of accessibility. So this is related to those who maybe are living with disability, individuals living with disability, right? So is your office space accessible for an individual who maybe has mobility issues? Is your website available, or could it be navigated using an e-reader, which is like a tool or device some individuals who are maybe visually or hearing impaired also use, so that way they can understand, it's just visually impaired, that way they can understand what they're navigating on their website. But then also location, right? This is really important to note in terms as well. Transportation. While some of us might be lucky enough to live in a metro area where there is public transportation, in our rural areas, when we talk about legal deserts, we're also in an area, right, or that also then comes to the issue where individuals have to travel long distances to receive maybe legal services. And so understanding that, how do we navigate that? Can we offer Zoom meetings with our clients? Can we offer some sort of waiver or stipend where we can travel to them, etc., things of that nature. We also need to start looking at the future value, right? So especially for us in solo practice, we have to start looking at the future value, right? What future do we see for maybe our solo practice? Do we have a succession plan lined up? Do we have a way to expand our business maybe during our slow times? And so that's really important to do. Then we can also broaden our networks through ISBA, interacting with our law schools. I think that's really important for all attorneys to be doing, especially as I mentioned, the brain drain that is occurring in our state. Career days, go to your local high schools, things of that nature, talk about the work that you do so you can inspire young individuals, maybe participate or create a mock trial program in your area. I know we were just talking about time constraints, but if you are someone who's lucky enough to have a little extra time, maybe you can spend that time with mock trial or pro bono work to broaden your network in the clients that you serve. Also, audit your referral services and your return on investments, right? Where are you marketing your firm, and in what ways is it intentional? And maybe looking at those ways that maybe aren't gaining you much traction, maybe remove them and look at different ways than that other marketing services could maybe provide you, or maybe broaden your network of clients, or even, right, talent if you're in a small firm. Then standardize your firm values. Again, an example of these could be maybe you're a client forward or client focused firm. Maybe you're a firm that is passionate about creating a collaborative environment. Whatever it is, having those values fleshed out early helps with those succession plannings, helps with vision and mission values, things of that nature. And it helps us, right, kind of gear our DEI initiatives in the direction of our missions and values. And so again, it's really important to have those things fleshed out, but then also becoming aware of our bias, right? Becoming bias aware. That's really important to note that we as people have to understand we're all biased. I oftentimes have heard people say, I don't see color. And while as great as that is, our minds do. Our minds do see color unconsciously and creates bias related to it. And again, I know I'm using race, but that's just an example there. And so it's important to note that we're biased towards any individual. We're always judging individuals. It's what our mind does. It observes and takes in information. We're curious creatures, but it's important to note that our mind sometimes plays tricks on us. And the more that we talk about implicit bias and talk about DEI concepts, it's statistically proven to decrease reports of harassment and things like that in the workplace. Again, maybe you're solo, small practice, so again, you don't maybe encounter that too often, but again, it can also help us serve our clients much more effectively. So DEI, right? Do team building exercises to enhance your collaboration. This is specific for our small firms. Having a day maybe of the week, if you're in a small firm where you're all meeting and chatting, maybe meeting with your partners, whatever it might be, that is essential. That's a great way to start creating collaborative efforts and start kind of that inclusive environment, right? If everyone is coming to this meeting and everyone's getting the opportunity to speak, we all feel included. Then maybe you're even a solo practitioner, but you have the privilege of having a receptionist. That's a great way to engage your receptionist, get to know them, and create a team environment through collaborative efforts. Then mentorship and sponsorship, and it's important to note that sponsorship does not always have to be monetary, but this is important for our next generation and also engaging our communities, right? So I just use the example of ISBA's mentorship program. Our law school works in our sections and committees. They create mentorship by engaging attorneys of various age, right? But then also they allow them to go further. So for example, maybe I want to sponsor a public event, and we'll talk about that in this next slide, or this next bullet here, our community engagement, especially if we're outside of metro areas. This is key effort in DEI initiatives, is getting involved in your communities. Again, sponsorship looks different in various ways. Again, we're here based in Des Moines, so I'll just use an example. There's community events going on all the time, and so there were some events going on last weekend. I'm trying to think of them, but maybe you can have a booth at a local community event. Maybe you can there's a lot of summer fests in rural Iowa I'm from rural Iowa. I'm remembering some of those, and maybe you can set up a booth there and let people know or inform people of the legal services that you provide. And again, I know that this is a lot of time, and maybe that takes up some of your free time on weekends, or maybe you're working on weekends. But again, regardless, that time then has a higher return on investment. And we can also audit that ourselves too, right? But then also getting involved in volunteering. It's a great way to engage with our communities, expand our networks, maybe also our client bases. Then marketing and messaging, using inclusive language and imagery to kind of give you a starting point for you in terms of that. ISBA created the Inclusion Reference Guide about a year ago now. It's actually an award-winning guide. We were lucky enough to receive an award, ISBA was, for the work that we did on our Inclusion Reference Guide. And it has a plethora of information on just how to get started on using inclusive language to avoid, things not to say, especially when we're talking about serving specific clients. And so that's a great resource that's available on our website, on our diversity page under diversity resources. Completely electronic, available to you all, and has some additional resources related to that ABA and things of that nature. But then how do we measure success, right? Especially when we're talking about being in a small or solo firm, you might be thinking, ugh, this work is a lot of hard work, right? And then so it's really important for us to set small and achievable goals, right? Not big overlofting projects, right? So that way we can easily not just achieve them, but also then build upon them, right? That's why I use this image here. It's like stepping stones. Once you've achieved one success, you can use that success to build onto another. And so start receiving client feedback, asking them, right, hey, how did you feel your services were? Did you feel like you had the opportunity to speak up and provide feedback to me when necessary? Things of that nature. Team satisfaction surveys are also really important, if applicable, especially for our small firms. Self-reflection is also key. If we know who we are as people, we can also then help better understand other people as well. Then again, you might be thinking, what are some goals, some of those small achievable goals that I could set for myself? Maybe you're really struggling to think of some, or maybe I just haven't given you a starting point yet. And if you haven't heard me give you a starting point or any examples of where you as a solo or small practitioner could start, the Young Lawyers Division of the Iowa State Bar Association created the Young Lawyers Division's DEI pledge. You can take the pledge, your firm can, and it gives you a various long list of goals that you can go through and maybe assign them or tweak them to be better fit for your firms. But that is also the DEI pledge was also gained a lot of recognition from our legal community. And as we slowly start to move forward in our DEI work, this is no longer something that ISBA is promoting, but we do want you all to know that it is still a resource available to you on our website, so that way you can find those goals and kind of keep that checklist for yourself. ISBA is just not doing that for you anymore. But also you can ask an expert. I already kind of shared that I myself am accessible to you all free of charge. Any question under the sun. I don't believe that there is such a silly question, and I'm pretty thick-skinned, so you can't offend me too much, because I assume that everyone reaching out to me has the best of intentions, even if there is not a positive impact on me. But it's the work that I choose to do, and it's what I love to do. So please feel free to reach out to me at any time to talk about your success, your next steps, where you can get started as well. Then again, some of those next steps and resources that I want to make sure that you're aware of. ISBA has a plethora of resources available to you all as solo small practitioners. Not only do we have solo small practice section, but we also have a diversity committee that you can be a part of, where you can start to learn more and engage in DEI efforts. Again, I've already mentioned our inclusion reference guide and our mentorship program. I also want to mention the Katie Fellowship. It's a great opportunity to engage with that next generation. The Katie Fellowship is a program geared towards law students in the state of Iowa to work at specific firms, and then for 10 weeks during their 1L to 2L summer. And it's a great opportunity for them to get their kind of feet wet here in Iowa, establish those networks of community and collaboration, and make it harder for them to leave our state, right? Because we're facing that brain drain. Then there's a large amount of affinity bar associations. The National Bar Association, I love to shout them out, of Iowa. The National Bar Association is the association geared towards Black and African American individuals. It was actually founded here in Iowa, and it's a great resource for individuals. You do not have to hold any sort of identity. You do not have to be Black or brown or African American to participate in the National Bar Association chapter of Iowa. And same goes for pretty much all affinity bar associations. There's the LGBTQ bar. There's NAPABA, which is our Native American, or excuse me, I believe that NAPABA is our Pacific Islander, Asian Pacific Islander bar association, excuse me there. And again, that list just keeps going on. And a lot of them also work in collaboration with other bar associations, not only throughout our nation, but specifically the ABA. The ABA has a huge, huge library of DEI resources available to you all in various areas. So I can't recommend that enough. Also find that comfortable starting point for you. Don't bite off more than you can chew. I always recommend looking at that DEI pledge, which is on our website for you to look through. And please feel free to reach out with any questions regarding any of those goals that maybe you want to set for yourself. Then also succession planning, especially for our solo practitioners. Start to look ahead, right? You might start to learn that maybe I do need to start looking at a new client base or hiring a new talent, whatever it might be, but then also strategic planning. Get those values and that missions fleshed out, so that way you can create initiatives that align with said mission and values. Finally, there is to keep learning. Please keep attending diversity CLEs that are hosted not only by ISBA, but also other certified bar associations, where you can get accredited, obviously. And keep learning about others first and foremost as well, because the more that we continue to learn, the more that we can better serve not only our clients, ourselves, but also our colleagues.